Hello, good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to all of you. Live from Washington, D.C., this is Ella Lazarte from USAID, where I lead our private sector and finance activities in the water and sanitation sector globally. Thank you so much for joining us in this first webinar of the series, Focus on Finance, particularly on tariffs. SWA, together with USAID and water.org, have co-convened this event on demystifying tariff discussions, the good, the bad, and the ugly. This webinar will provide practical examples to better understand the political economy of tariffs in both urban and rural contexts. The speakers will address three facets about tariffs: the ugly truth of flow tariffs, inequalities and low coverage; the bad, lack of incentives to improve performance and low willingness to pay; and the good, examples from countries in different parts of the world that have addressed the issue and how they've done it. They've done it, such as in Uganda, Burkina Faso, Philippines, and Kenya. In this webinar, we try to bring you different perspectives, from public utilities to a private one and a regulatory agency. So we look forward to our discussions and questions and comments from you. So first, we will have some welcoming remarks from Ms. Diane Dahas, who has held many positions of responsibility and was able to develop extensive operational experience within utilities, first in her native country of France, and since 1993, worldwide in different continents. She was recently the president of the International Water Association. Go ahead, Diane.
Ok, bonjour. Je vais parler français puisque ce séminaire est en anglais et en français. Pour une fois, je vais profiter de ma langue native pour expliquer surtout sur un sujet important.
Things about an important and complex issue, tariffication, but it is critical when we talk about the financing of water utilities, being them private or public. I'm really pleased to launch this subject because, as I said, it's very important, and tariffication is probably one of the most complex issues. It might not be well apprehended today, so it's important to develop an expertise and discussions, exchanges. Tariffication is complex because it looks to solve three objectives that can be very different. It can have different implications. The first objective, which is quite obvious, is to have water services that can be financially sustainable in the long term. And this is important because otherwise it can lead progressively to disasters and difficulties. And we have many examples on that. And the other objective, which is gaining in importance and has been underscored recently, the users need to be able to pay the services. They need to be affordable. So tariffication needs to cover that aspect as well. Everybody should have access to water, independent of their financial resources. And the third thing, which is more and more important, is environmental efficiency in a world which will experience water scarcity. So the assessment can lead to wrong conclusions, and this can be dangerous. So I'll try to launch the debate and structure the subject. Financial balance is very important. And the principle of having the consumer paying the bills is a strong principle. And it is important because public services, states, and local communities might not always have the resources to subsidize and provide free water. And there have been decisions made meaning that the users need to contribute and pay for the service. Having water at home is a true service, and it is important. The principle of paying also means, and this has been reminded by the resolution, by the UN resolution, it means that there's a right to water. But this does not mean that water should be free. It only says that everyone should have access to water, and there should be means, technical means to access water. Otherwise, equity is not there. And when we say that it should be financially sustainable, we need to take into account all the costs for water. Tariffs need to reflect financial reality. And there can be many perspectives which all need to be taken into account. But for the long term, the operation should be balanced and sustainable. Of course, the investment strategies could be different because it's a one-off approach. The analysis can differ, but the costs should be well assessed, and the strategies should favor a good balance in the operations for the long term. Let's not forget that in the end, what we want is to be paid. We cannot only invoice, we need to recover the costs as well. Sometimes we tend to forget that if tariffication is not well developed, if the communities cannot afford to pay, you can get very varying results where some pay and others don't. And it's not necessarily the poorest that do not pay. So we need to factor in the capacity to recover costs. And there's also the capacity of people to pay. The tariffs should allow everyone to pay. And what's important is to make sure that if some groups need to be subsidized, the tariffication can be such as allowing the richest to pay for the poorest. But it's always a bit dangerous because this can lead to economical imbalances. So maybe there should be systems in cooperation with local communities with checks, meaning that some groups can recover some of the costs, or they can be subsidized to afford to pay for water. In some systems, you can keep tariffs that reflect reality, and you can have a parallel system helping the poorest ones. And the third criteria is efficiency. A bad tariffication is bad for efficiency. Before, water had fixed costs. So there were subscriptions with fixed costs that were very high and marginal costs that were very low. But this wasn't good because water was dilapidated. So maybe we could have a progressive tariffication, even if it does not reflect the economic reality, because this can lead to the sensitivization of the groups. They realize that it helps to save water, but this should not be detrimental to large families. So this should be discussed between the water services and the water authority. There's no ideal system, but every service needs to make the good analysis and the good tariffication. As I said, this is a real challenge, but it cannot be reached if we do not decide that we need to have counters. We need to know the reality. If we do not know what the users consume, it leads to nothing. So we need to have intelligent counters, preferably. But 20 years ago, there was a debate about counters, but now we know that we need counters. We know that we can decouple the results from the counter and the bill, but we need to know what is consumed, where the water goes, and how all this works. And then we might need to insist on one point, and there's a debate. The IWA, the International Water Association, considers that water regulators can be very important, and they can help to develop good tariffications, because the water services might not always give the good doctrine, but a regulator that can help water services to find a good tariffications that can stimulate them in their discussion sounds interesting. So our organization is favorable to the establishment of regulators. They have really helped in putting them in touch with each other. We do not interfere. Every organization, every country needs to find their own system, but really regulators can help in this complicated debate. So what is the right system in a country, in a city? As I said, it's really complex. So thank you for inviting me. I'm really pleased to participate today.
Great. Merci beaucoup. Thank you so much, Diane, for your great opening remarks that get us all started. And our next distinguished speaker is Dr. Catarina Fonseca, who is a senior advisor of SWA and associate of IRC. She's an economist working in the water sector for 22 years and has done extensive research and advocacy work on costs and financing the water sector, and advises governments, support agencies, and civil society organizations. She's also the co-author of the Sanitation and Water for All SWA Handbook for Finance Ministers. And Catarina, Dr. Fonseca will provide us a general overview presentation on tariffs. Over to you, Catarina.
Thank you, Ella. Thank you, Diane, for that great introduction, and good morning or good afternoon or good evening to all of you. I'm very happy to be here with you to discuss tariffs. I think in my work as an economist in the sector, this is probably the issue we talk least about. It's a little bit of a taboo, not the technical side of it, but the political side of it. And I can see by the amount of questions that we got even before the webinar and the amount of questions being posted on the chat, that is the case. So please feel free. If we can't address them all during this webinar, we will attempt to do it elsewhere. I start with the usual number. Our financial challenge in the water sector, meeting SDG 6, actually meeting only target 1 and 2, universal access to water and sanitation, 114 billion USD dollars a year are required. This estimate is mostly for infrastructure construction. It does not include the cost of repairing, replacing, upgrading. As we know from many of the countries where we work, many utilities and service providers are not even able to recover the costs of minor maintenance, of major maintenance, not to talk about having a surplus to finance capital works. So big picture numbers, these are very different per country. Why do utilities need revenues? And I think Diane mentioned already some of them. They need revenues to keep the existing services to existing customers. They need revenues to be able to improve the quality, the reliability, the availability of water to also to existing customers. And very, very important, in reaching sustainable development goals, they need to expand the services to those that lack access. Overview, what kind of costs do service providers and utilities need to meet? Diane mentioned some of them, minor and major operations and maintenance, but also capital expenses. And in capital expenses, I would like to also underline the borrowing costs, so the cost of loans. And if there have been investments by investors in the utilities and service providers, the utilities do need to have a surplus, usually mentioned as profit, but in fact is a return on capital invested by investors. What are the sources? We all, by now, I see many of colleagues online, we know the three sources we have. On one hand, we have the taxes, local taxes, state taxes, national taxes. On the other hand, we have aid. We have the bilateral, multilateral organizations, foundations, international NGOs, and the third source that we're going to be talking about today a lot, tariffs. Tariffs or user fees paid for the connections, paid by renting meters, paid by the amount of water consumed. There's a fourth way of financing, which is to get loans. However, loans, repayable finance, will need a stable and sufficient revenue base. And I go back to the stable and sufficient. And within this picture, the stable and sufficient revenue base to be able to repay those loans are the tariffs. Now, here we go. I'm going to start talking about the good. The good is that in our sector, we're very good to discuss the technical side of what I call the technical side of tariffs. And that's pretty much the structure. What should be incorporated into the tariffs, the connection fees, fixed charge fees. You've probably seen this graph many times, increasing block tariffs, decreasing block tariffs. We won't have time to go into the technical aspect because this webinar is going to talk about the political side of things, the tariff level. What is actually the total average price? How much does a utility need to recover from those costs? It's just the minor operation maintenance costs, major. It includes depreciation, it includes returns on capital. What is the level of cost recovery that it's necessary is already a political discussion that we are not having it enough in the sector. These things are not being discussed, or the discussions are not transparent enough. Diane mentioned that some of objectives of tariffs, or some of the objectives when tariffs need to be reformed. And at the moment, I'm listing here many of what is asked by different stakeholders of tariff reform. As you can see, many of these are actually competing against each other. And setting the right objectives for tariffs, first, they will not be able to cope with all of this. And then is really a balancing act. I only have time, I have my timer on. I have time to go into the two most important ones, which is cost recovery. How much of the costs will service providers and utilities recover from the tariffs? And affordability. Can users pay to access a service? And these two are very important, but what's happening at the moment is that prices and tariffs are kept artificially low, so trying to meet an affordability target, while at the same time, they are not bringing enough revenues to utilities. And this gets into the ugly side of what the situation does, is that actually we are subsidizing those who already can pay. And you know, I mean, all the countries that I've been, When I'm doing surveys in the field, I ask how much are women paying for this 20-liter buckets, waiting hours in line. And then I go and ask my colleagues in Addis, in Nairobi, in Delhi, how much they're paying for water. And it's a huge inequality. So by trying to meet these two, we are actually, it's a very ugly side. We are subsidizing those that already have good services. And we know this sometimes instinctively in the countries where we live, in the cities where we live, but the World Bank has done a very good study. It's called Doing More with Subsidies. And there's an amazing amount of information. It's a lengthy report, but it's very, very good. I would like to just show one data set. They did a deep dive in 10 countries. And most of the subsidies have been provided through the tariffs by keeping them artificially low. And 56% of those subsidies are reaching the wealthiest quintile of the population on average, while only 6% is actually reaching the poor. So this is the ugly side of tariffs. Now, my two last slides. At present, the main challenges that we see to tariff reform is that many utilities are trapped. They don't have enough money for covering maintenance, expansion, improving service. So they don't have enough revenues to cover those costs. Then they're providing low level of services, and therefore they cannot increase tariffs. So there's a lack of trust in the utility to improve services, or a perception they are not operating efficiently, when actually many of them are doing a lot with very, very little. There's also, so outside of utility management, there's a belief that current tariff setting is working, that we shouldn't change the situation, a perception that increases prices is politically unpopular, and the belief that tariff reforms cannot be discussed or are too difficult to address. And this is dangerous. It's dangerous when it becomes a belief. It becomes a belief of leadership in some of our sector in many countries. It becomes a belief in agencies, in aid agencies, that this is too difficult. It's not. This is a technical issue. We discuss water quality. We discuss very complex issues in the water sector, so we can also discuss tariff reform. And I think a lot of these are based on perceptions, and the positive aspect here is that perceptions can be changed with data, can be changed with evidence. So the elements of a successful tariff reform are ensuring effective communication and dialogue. What is actually working? What is not working? Are the subsidies achieving what we want them to achieve? When was the last time that we discussed the objectives of tariffs? How many of that long list? Is it conservation of resources? Is it efficiency? What are the targets of our tariffs, the objectives? Are we reaching them? And if not, what needs to change? Cultivating credibility, integrity, and transparency with several groups of stakeholders. It's a technical issue. It can also be discussed in a very non-technical manner. It does not have to be complicated. And of course, then we're going to have a lot of the speakers from very successful utilities on this webinar, and the importance of having incremental service improvements while tariffs are increasing is also very important. Depoliticizing the tariff process through tariff regulation. Diane talked about the importance of the regulator, of this external independent body. Revenue ring fencing, so when the tariffs are being able to be ring fenced, to be invested in services again. There's many indexing tariffs to taxation, to inflation. There are many things we're going to discuss in this webinar, and I would like to end with leadership, which probably should be also at the top, in the middle, at the end of this list. Without leadership from heads of states, it will be very difficult to go through tariff reforms. And I look forward to hear our other speakers talking about it. Thank you very much. Over to you, Ella.
Great. Thank you so much, Katarina. And definitely leadership is at the forefront of all of these discussions, and as well as the good and the ugly side. So next up is Dr. Engineer Silva Mugisha. He's currently serving as the Managing Director of the National Water and Sewerage Corporation, or NWSC, in Uganda. He has over 25 years of experience in utility management and has worked on external consultations in over 10 countries. He is also former Vice President and board member of the International Water Association, IWA, and the current president of the Africa Water Association. And over to you, Mr. Mugisha. And before he starts, I just want to remind people, please keep on putting your comments or questions in the chat box. Thank you. Over.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me here. And I want to talk about the political economy of tariff changes. And to begin with, I really want to discuss with you the case study of national water. Now, National Water and Sewerage Corporation is a public utility with a vision of being one of the best in the world. We now operate in 258 towns, and we are still improving. We have a water for all agenda, and everything we do here is all aimed at making sure that everybody in Uganda gets water services. There is a slide which shows the journey we have made in the last 30 years, from 1990 to now. We've made significant strides, and because of the tariff we have, we've been able to raise the revenues, annual turnover from 4 million US dollars per annum. We now have about 130 million US dollars per annum, with a significant increase in operating profits that are enabling us to do a lot of work on investments. There is a slide to look at all these details, and what is important there is the operating surplus, which you can see there as a result of the tariff adjustments we have been having. Now, I want to come directly to the issue of tariffs. And our point here is it is a political decision to recover part of all the costs. Sorry?
Sorry to interrupt, Dr. Mugisha. We cannot see the slides. Would you be able to advance them?
Oh, you can't see the slides.
We just see the title slide.
It shows here that we are sharing the slide. Can you see the slides? Because here it is showing that we are sharing it.
We can just see the title slide.
I think the slide shouldn't be an issue. Technology now, if you can see, you just hear what I'm saying. We are saying that as far as the tariffs are taken to work and a lot of politics, and normally politics comes in to determine the level of tariffs we have. And you know, many utilities, including national water, one of the problems we face as a result of poor coverage is the high financially unsustainable utilities. There's heavy reliance on external financing, money from donors, which normally comes to utilities like national water as grants from government. And of course, we have very limited revenues to support our own. You can't see it there, but here I can see it. Then we share the slides. Mr. Bill Kingdom should be able to share with you. Our average tariff is about $1 US per unit of water.
Dr. Magisha, how about
sorry?
I will just have Larissa from our organizing team share your slides, and then so you can just speak. And hopefully the connection will improve with that. I'm so sorry for the interruption. But you can stop sharing the slide and someone else from our team can share it so the participants can see, and all you have to do is speak then. We will share the slides from our side to make it easier. Thank you so much. So if you could just stop sharing. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm now on the slide of the national water current tariff structure. And you clearly see that there, our average tariff is about $1 US per unit of water. And what comes out prominently there is the tariff for the poor. The tariff for the poor is about 30 cents, and that is the lowest. And the tariff for industries is also about 70 cents, which is a lower band compared to. I think I am on the slide for national water current tariff. So if you can go down, continue the slide. That's not the right one. Continue the slide. That's not the one I'm on. Continue down. Continue. That's where I am. So the tariff for the industry, you have gone a bit further. The tariff for the industry is about 70 cents, and then the tariff for domestic is about for national water is that it is uniform across all towns, and the smaller towns are subsidized by the bigger. Is enough to cover all nation, and we also cover. Now, what are the challenges? What are the challenges we have encountered? We have a tariff indexation policy, but we tend to be very sensitive the way we apply it, because when people get a feeling that the tariffs have been increased, it is a problem. So there is also a bit of stakeholder engagement. And before we increase the tariff, we have to make sure that the board scrutinizes it and approves the results of our tariff indexation. And the tariff indexation we do takes care of inflation. It also takes care of the power, if there are changes in the power costs, changes in the foreign exchange thresholds. Then we do a tariff indexation to try to protect our tariff against those exogenous factors. And one of the challenges we have faced of recent was, again, from the political side, the need to enhance industrial growth. We were directed by government that we needed to reduce industrial tariff and compensate it through domestic and commercial tariff. And of course, that caused the tariff adjustment. Then there is a huge high tariff rhetoric in Uganda here, and you always have to continuously sensitize the public. Then, of course, the people who are in charge of approving tariffs here tend to be conflicted because they feel themselves are going to be affected, and that tends to bring. Now, as a result, we have had delayed tariff adjustment, new growth, and of course that has resulted into delayed infrastructure investment. Now, addressing these challenges, we normally carry out tariff indexation annually to ensure that there are only small adjustments that cannot cause shock to the customers. And actually, when we apply tariff indexation, our customers take time to notice that even those adjustments have been carried out. Now, the industry to enhance industrial growth, but that has been subsidized by domestic and commercial tariff. Then, of course, we carry out continuous simplified visuals of our tariff, trying to compare our tariff with other commodities on the market. And our customers have now come to appreciate that our tariff is really not high. They only need to control the amount of water they are using in order to manage the cost. And for those stakeholders who are hesitant to approve our tariffs, we normally speak the same language, show them what the adjustment of the tariff is going to cause in terms of more investments, in terms of more people covered, in terms of more infrastructure carried out. And that is how they come to appreciate that we need to adjust the tariff, or we need to index the tariff to make sure that those investments are kept there. So those are the few things I wanted to share with the group, and I'm happy to get the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mugisha. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for your flexibility. And so for our next speaker, we were originally going to have Mr. Haruna, who was the Director General for ONYA in Burkina Faso, the national water utility, as well as the President of the Africa Water Association. But unfortunately, he is not able to make it today. And so to present today is the Country Director for IRC in Burkina Faso, Mr. Just Nancy. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. Let me share my screen now. Okay, I can't share my screen, so I guess that someone could open my PowerPoint, please. Can anyone put on my PowerPoint, please? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead. Your PowerPoint's on right now. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So yeah, I'm really sorry that Mr. Haruna couldn't make it. I'm not specializing on this issue of tariff for urban water, but I'll try to share the presentation that Mr. Haruna prepared. So, and this is in French, so I will switch in French. Donc, la présentation porte sur la tarification de l'eau en milieu urbain au Burkina Faso.
So this is about water tarification in urban environment in Burkina Faso. As I said, I'm not an expert, but I will try to present what has been prepared by my colleague. Next slide.
Diapo suivante, s'il vous plaît. Diapo
Next,
suivante, s'il vous plaît.
next slide, please.
Pouvez changer de diapo, s'il vous plaît?
Could you
J'ai du mal
please
hein, pour changer à mon niveau.
change slide? I'm not able to do it myself.
Can we change to the next slide, please?
Next slide, please.
Can you hear me?
Just Katerina speaking, we can hear you. We were having issues with also the slide presentation, as you might notice.
Okay.
But just give a second to Larissa. She's trying to manage several screens.
I can see. Okay, good.
Okay, just keep going, and we will try to catch up with the slides.
Okay, good. So I will use my own slides here just for. Okay, so donc pour l'historique, rapidement pour vous indiquer.
Brief background. Our organization was created in 1985 as a public organization. The state is the sole owner, and its mission is to provide drinking water and sanitation in urban environment with more than 10,000 inhabitants. In 1993, the agreement between the state and our organization improved. We now have a performance-based agreement, and this year we have reached the 9th agreement with 9 indicators, technical and financial. This way, the ONA knows what its tasks are, and we know the responsibility of the state. And the ONA is considered as a reference organization based on several comparative studies when it comes to water management, and it is relied on by several partners which also support us. And those are the figures for 2018. It has increased a bit, but we are managing 59 centers covering 5.6 million inhabitants, and half of them are in the capital city. So, and the connection rate is over 90%. We invoice 68 million cubic meter of water. So, and the tariff is around $1 per cubic meter. So 9 people per private connection, a little less than 40 liters per person and per day as average consumption. Let's continue with key figures. We can see that the number of active subscribers has increased by 9% between 2013 and 2017, and the water volumes in the household has increased by 7% during the same time period, but there's still a decrease of the daily consumption. It has gone from 11.5 cubic meter per month in 2013 to a bit more than 2 in 2017. Let's look at the tariff structure. It is layered. First of all, 0 to 1,000 cubic meters, 188 franc CFA, 2.5 euro per cubic meter. And then the second layer, around 3.5 euros. So the first level was 0.5 euro. The second level was 0.7 euro. I'm sorry, I do not have the right translations. And then the third layer, around 1 euro. So the previous layers were below 1 euro. And then you have the next layer around 2 euro per cubic meters. And that system has been developed to facilitate the access to water for the more vulnerable populations. And the richest groups consuming more pay more. And the price paid by the more vulnerable ones in the first layer is below than the actual cost for water. So the richer pay for the poorest. And the highest layer, 2 euros, is paid by big industries and richer households. If we look at the development of the system between 2002 and 2018, it has improved because the cost has increased. So 180 to 188 franc for the lowest layer, but all the other layers have really developed much more. So that our organization can have sustainable finances while ensuring access to the most vulnerable populations. This is the principle for the tariffication, and this is supported by public authorities. This is important to mention because the state approves the proposal from the ONA based on their specifications and the agreement, but it is the state authorities which approve the tariffication and the subsidy system. So what are our challenges? They're even more complex. First of all, we have universal access by 2030. The whole population needs to be covered. So the poorest will consume much more water. And there cannot be a proportional increase to maintain the balance. We have a problem with private connections. The private connections are not sufficiently used because people tend to go back to pipe water, even if they have access to private connections. And the average prices are constantly decreasing because we need more and more investments. And many investments in urban areas are based on loans. So it is a big challenge. We need to be able to invest and at the same time pay back our loans. So we need to look at our debt capacity in relation with the investments that are needed. And the leadership and the governance is now weaker. We've had problem implementing the investments because our leadership has changed and the investments have slowed down. So we've had problems realizing the SDGs. That's basically our main challenges. And today, we're wondering what developments should be chosen to still have equity, to still give access to water to all, but at the same time, give incentives to the utilities, and the richest populations need to continue to finance the poorest ones. In Burkina Faso, could we have a system based on discounts? Could we have differentiated tariffs based on the size of households, for example, to develop tariffication? They could also be a differentiation by economic centers, taking into account the local economies. So those are various options that we're reflecting on today. Thank you.
Over to you. I think I finished the presentation.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you so much for your presentation.
You're welcome.
I know that was a last minute sub, so thank you very much appreciated. Our next presentation for today will be Bill Kingdom, who will be presenting for Mr. Perry Rivera from Manila Water. So unfortunately, Mr. Rivera is actually stuck in Congress at the moment as they're discussing a very important topic. And so he was just in touch with us saying that they're up next in the queue and will not be able to make this particular session. So over to you, Bill, for presenting the Manila Water case.
Okay, thank you very much, Ella. And good morning,
beaucoup.
Good afternoon to everyone.
Bon après-midi à tous.
Sorry, I just removing the translator. So Perry, as Ella has said, obviously wanted to be here today, but has been delayed due to his participation in Parliament in Manila. So these are his slides, and I think they are a PDF, so I'm afraid that they're not PPTs. But let's start. Sorry, just whilst I got myself organized. I mean, Perry's key messages are put up front here, because I think he wanted to show that in some respects, a crisis actually triggered the events that we're about to see in the following slides in terms of how the water sector in Manila has changed over the last 25 years. And the start, I think, was an El Nino effect, which was causing severe water constraints in Manila. And the government then decided that they should take some action because perhaps they felt that the public entity hadn't been able to respond effectively to this crisis. So if I move down, we'll see what the situation was just prior to the privatization. And I think, many of these pictures are familiar to us. On the left-hand side, this kind of spaghetti of pipe connections using just plastic hoses, which were all illegal and unmetered. And in the bottom left, you can see they were held together with bits of tape. So the leakage levels were also very high. The infrastructure had deteriorated, massive leaks, and there was a poor quality of service. And in 1997, as is shown here, there were just 3.1 million customers, but the quality of service varied from just the green area, which were fortunate to have a 24-hour supply, through the yellow to the red, where the supply was less than 12 hours a day. So in a way, this was the foundation from which the concessionaires started. And it meant there was maybe a distrust, as it were, between the customer and the utility. And that had to be bridged. So the concession framework that set out to bridge this gap was essentially to establish, through an act, a regulatory office, the Manila Water Regulatory Agency, and then to have two long-term concessions, one covering the East Zone and one covering the West Zone. And Manila Water Company, which Perry represents, is the East Zone. But the important thing is, I think, that the approach that the government took was about addressing many of the challenges that face the public sector utility. So how to expand service, how to improve the quality of service, and then how to increase efficiency. Because these three core elements will improve the relationship between the utility and the customer. And through that, discussions about and changes to tariffs can take place. So in terms of the performance, these slides show us very well what Manila Water Company has been able to achieve over the last 25 years or 20 years. Massive increase in the network, massive increase in the volume of water delivered to customers, the top right-hand graphic, where we can see the amount of water delivered to customers has pretty much trebled. And one of the reasons that that has been achieved is the bottom left-hand corner, which is that Manila Water Company, NWSC, spent a huge amount of effort in reducing water losses. And that freed up water that could then be provided to customers. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, another innovation was a program called TPSB, which is the Too Big Para sa Barangay approach, which is essentially an urban poor program, delivering services to the urban poor. And again, that delivered nearly 2 million urban poor customers into the service area of NWSC. And of course, this creates goodwill from those who are currently or were previously unserved. So those few slides kind of set out the crisis that kicked off the reform in the sector in Manila through long-term concession contracts, and also demonstrate how those concession contracts really delivered results for the customer. And I think that is a launch point really for Perry's next few slides, which were his insights on tariffs. So if we start, then now, over the period of the concession, the tariff has moved to being close, as he put it, to full cost recovery, and an increase of 10 times since 1997. Now, I think that is achievable because of the previous slides: better service, better quality service, more efficient, more customer responsive, creates the goodwill, creates the trust. But importantly, the establishment of the regulatory agency was able to depoliticize the tariff setting process, which was also described in the concession contract agreements. So the agreement plus the regulator together were able to, in a way, remove the tariff setting process directly from the political process. And that, alongside performance improvements, enabled this change in tariffs to take place. So the tariffs that are there, 10 times more than they were in 1997, are still generally affordable. And I think that's a critical point to bear in mind. Because of the way NWSC addressed its inefficiency, it had very low levels of collection at the start of the concession. So by increasing collection efficiency, they immediately increased their revenue stream without having to affect tariffs at all. They drove down leakage levels, which I mentioned earlier. That again improved efficiency and further, in a way, reducing the pressure on the tariff. But then finally, they also came up with a socialized tariff structure so that those increases could be absorbed by poor households. There are still issues going forwards for MWC. And obviously the first is the rapid rate of urbanization, which continues in Manila. So the demand for water is increasing, and that's putting a lot of pressure on the environment. So environmental compliance costs are increasing, and then climate change mitigation or resilience, the costs are also increasing. So looking forwards, MWC plus their regulator will have to work out how to balance the competing demands from the environment, from the customer, and from the utility to come up with a tariff approach which will satisfy and balance these different interests. The second bullet, in a way, is a broader issue around SDG 6 and meeting the universal coverage target. Clearly, what Manila Water Company has done has greatly improved coverage and quality of service, so they're doing their bit. But ultimately, I think he's saying the Philippines as a whole still faces some challenges, which I think all of us see in the various countries in which we work. And then the 3 T's, the taxes, tariffs, and transfers. And the tariff remains the most reliable cost recovery mechanism. This is true. I think people understand that taxes or subsidies, for example, can be quite unpredictable. Tariffs come from the customer, they're collected by the utility, and they depend on the quality of service delivered by the utility. So tariffs are important, as I think was mentioned by Diane at the opening, because it also builds that relationship, the customer service provider relationship, which is critical to a well-run utility. So those were the points that Perry wanted to make. I've tried to make them as best I can. I'm sure Perry would have done a much better job, But there we are, and thank you very much for listening to me. And I will now hand back to Ella. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks so much, Bill. Great job representing Perry here today. And so our last—
You're on mute, Ella.
Oh, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, you are not on
Okay,
mute.
great. So great job, Bill, on representing Perry today. Thank you so much for sharing with us a little bit of the Manila water case. And so that is the last of our utility speakers for today, our panelists. The next, the last but not the least is Mr. Robert Gakubia, who is outgoing CEO of the Kenya Water Services Regulatory Board, or WASREB, and it's a position he has held since July 2008. And before that, Robert was the Director of Water Services at the Ministry of Water, Sanitation, and Irrigation. And it was a position he rose to after having held other senior positions in the ministry. And so over to you, Mr. Gakubia, for that regulatory perspective to share with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, moderator, and hello to everybody. I want to start by saying that cost recovery, where tariff comes in, has been a policy of the Kenyan government for a very long time. But implementation of that policy has been a problem. So when the crisis towards the end of the 1990s, beginning of 2000, came in, and we made a political decision to restructure the water sector. The regulator was established during that period, and it was now the job of the regulator to implement the cost recovery policy and also address the crisis that we were having in the water sector in general. And it was a crisis, as they say, a crisis of lows. There was hardly any investment happening in the sector. There was hardly any revenue, at least revenue to be used even to sustain the services. There was also hardly any quality of service you can talk about. It was very poor. And even the quality of management was also very poor. So there was a lot of mismanagement all through. And that was because of the issue of tariffs. The water services were not able to raise their own, its money so that they are able to sustain themselves. So the many very fast objectives for this restructuring of the sector were to address the efficiency in the sector and also the viability of water service provision in terms of it sustaining itself, and also the equity, because it was also noted that there was a lot of neglect within the low income areas, which of course was also a political problem. So the points I would like to share, I've already shared with the organizers, but I would like to briefly just touch on them. One, of course, is there is always a resistance of tariff increase by governments, whether national or subnational. We actually have a two-level system of government where we have regional governments, about 47 of them, and you can imagine speaking in one voice, but that has not been a major issue. We actually talk to these governments on a one-on-one basis. So there has been that resistance of tariff increase, and we as a regulator, we have been addressing this through a public consultation process and engaging the subnational governments in that public consultation process, and actually getting their buy-in and getting their more or less their sign to go ahead with the tariff review. We don't first of all talk about tariff increase. Yes, we know that the tariff increase is required because they have been low for very many years, but we talk about tariff review. The increase comes in when we are telling them that to address even the fiscal deficit they themselves have and the pressure they have to address the service delivery issues, then the tariff is a very important aspect of that part of that chain of service delivery. There's also the low income areas. As I said, there are equity issues there, but the low income areas have basically been vote-rich areas for politicians. So when the prices are going up, the politicians make it a political issue, and they actually promise that no tariffs will go up in these areas. But of course, they never promise that the service delivery will continue, in fact, or even it will improve. So we have addressed that issue through focusing on these poor areas and guiding our utilities as how they should address the services in those low-income areas. There are also lobby groups, the business community. They always look at any increase, not only of tariff, but for this one, they look at the tariff increase as an increase in the cost of doing business. So during the consultation process, we also handle these through focused meetings with the business groups. And you basically realize that their worry was not even the tariff. It is really some other interests that they have, either political or otherwise. There has also been the steady increase of tariffs, which has been a problem. You know, if you wait for 5 years to increase a tariff, everybody sees that as a very, very big jump. So we have addressed that through a process we call tariff indexation. I was looking at the chart there and I was seeing some of the participants raising the issue of tariff indexation. This helps a lot in making sure that you don't have those big increases. You can have a near increase, of course, fixed to which is basically also looking at the inflation aspect. And this will, of course, cushion the consumers from the price shocks that they have experienced maybe after 5 years, or even in this case, when we started, it was actually after like more than 15 years when the tariff was last reviewed. There's also, of course, the foreign exchange aspect, because a lot of the inputs that our utilities use are imported. So there is always the issue of prices changing. And this has been addressed through this tariff indexation. There's something that has also been mentioned in the chat about election cycle. This is also a very, very, very emotive and very hot political issue when you are doing tariffs, especially close to the election. So we address this also through the consultation process, and especially engaging the county governments. And as I said, once they realize that it removes even partly the pressure or even subsidizing, in as much as there is subsidies needed, it removes the pressure of subsidizing just by making sure that the tariff is going up after 1 or 2 years like that. And they have actually been able to support us through the process. And in this process, the regulator works very closely with the utilities to make sure that nobody misinterprets. Yes, tariff is a political decision in the sense that the cost recovery is already a policy decision. But to come up to how much tariff or how much how much tariff consumers should pay, that should not be a political decision. It should be a technical decision. The political aspect comes in when you are trying to balance the social and economic objectives of the whole process. There's also the issue of infrastructure and public investments. I mean, we all know that our politicians love big infrastructure for many reasons, but we of course, each of us has an idea of why they do it. But this infrastructure sometimes need to be balanced with improved performance of the utility and also the overall sector efficiency and access and quality of service for the people. But sometimes you find that this is really not balanced. So there is ineffective coordination between the two levels of government, because the big infrastructure comes from the national government, and the utilities are as part of the subnational government operation. So there's always a problem, because when you're addressing tariffs, then you might find that what national government wants to be addressed, because these are loans that need to be repaid, sometimes may not be really what they either benefit from, or it's something that really needs to be addressed through the tariffs. That becomes now a problem. For that long period of consultation, which we have, because before a tariff is approved, it takes like about 6 months. It makes us actually address the consumer concerns in terms of balancing of performance improvements. I mean, we all know that we are always talking about a tariff increase, and service improvements are not moving at also a reasonable rate. Then consumers become disillusioned, and they can even actually just oppose the tariff increase, and you really have no recourse in terms of getting the money you need for operations. There is also the non-revenue water aspect, which is non-revenue water in our country is actually taken as a proxy for mismanagement. We all know that all those losses have a governance aspect. That means some of them should not, if you address the governance issues, some of them should not come in. And governance is basically a political economy issue. So we need to really look at that. And sometimes it is very difficult to explain to the people a tariff increase when the non-revenue water levels are very high. They actually don't understand why one needs to increase the tariff to address or to take care of their own inefficiencies. That has been a major point. In conclusion, I really want to say that we, as a regulator, we constantly engage the county governments and our utilities, especially in capacity building, to make sure that there is a common understanding of the tariff. It has been a major issue, but I want to say that for the efforts we have put, we have seen tariff revenues rise for the last 15 years from about $50 million to now at the level of $220 million, to an extent that even the private sector and the banking industry is taking note of the cash flows within the water sector. And I'd really like to see how they can be part of the growth process. And these are discussions that are going on. We have been able to even facilitate, together with the banking industry, facilitate water service providers or our utilities to even get commercial financing, which is actually repaid through the revenues we raise. But I mean, the discussions we have had is not that they have always been smooth, but we have basically tried to reduce the passion for those people who are against tariff reviews, because in the end, I think the services might collapse, and I think there will be no subsidy that will be forthcoming, because these are subsidies, and whatever other money is either international money or local money are not very predictable, and we really need to see how we can have organic growth in the funding for our utilities. Until recently now, there is the regulator's job, for example, to address the issue of sanitation. And we have been allowed to discuss by law, but to discuss with the utilities how now we can bring in sanitation costs to the whole process. And our view as a regulator has been that a water service provider, our utility, needs to address the issue of sanitation. And quite a bit of these aspects of sanitation, which affect directly the water service itself, can actually be addressed through tariff. And we are allowed by law now to discuss a sanitation surcharge. We have already done studies to guide us in that, and I can say that we are already implementing a tariff. I mean, a kind of a pilot through one of our utilities, one of the to make sure that this is actually accepted politically, and by the benefits that it brings in terms of improving the water and the overall water and sanitation service coverage. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Mr. Gakubia. That was a great presentation. Definitely a lot to balance there. I heard you talk about, mention the word balance a few times, and I think that is definitely one of the key challenges, is how do you balance consumer interests, affordability, all of these different principles, consumer concerns. And then also, thank you for highlighting sanitation. It's definitely not talked about, so thank you for sharing that last bit. So now we have slightly under 10 minutes for questions and answers and a discussion, so I will go straight there. Our first question is, tariff is alien to many Africans as they believe water is a human right, and government has promised free water as part of their campaign promise. How will a utility manager convince the citizen enjoying water whose OpEx, or operations expenditure, is highly costly intensive, that water is not free? Could a couple of the speakers comment on this issue of the belief that water is a human right and that it should be free? And you could just, for the panelists, you could just unmute yourself if you want to speak or comment on this.
Yeah, maybe if you want me to comment.
You want to get us started? Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Merci.
thanks to come. I think the idea of having water for free is very dangerous. Of course, if politicians take that and then they have to assume. But as I was saying, is the human right is absolutely not to have water for free. It's much more important to have the right to have water coming. To have water coming from to your house 24 hours a day to be sure that you can have a service. But I don't think people expect a service for free. They expect a service which is really reliable of good water for some price. And of course, that price has to be affordable. But free is probably a very dangerous and absolutely not efficient. So we need to avoid that. It should be at reasonable price, but not for free. That's a bit what is important to repeat. Otherwise, you go to a cow and you won't give, you maybe will give water for free, but you won't give water. In fact, you will go to a non-service for free.
Great. Thank you very much for that short but really clear response. I will use my moderator hat since I have the floor to say that it's definitely also very important coming from USAID that we promote that thinking. That it's...
Can I comment on that?
And yes, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I think in our, and I'm really talking from our own context, a lot of this talk about water being free is basically rhetoric. Even the same politicians who talk about it, they never push the debate forward. So, and we challenge them now when we come to a one-on-one and we tell, ideally nothing is free. So somebody is paying for it. So even when you talk about free, you have to provide it through taxes. So we actually challenge them on the budget. Then we challenge them in terms of in their budget right now, how much have they allocated for water? So if they have not allocated anything, who did they expect to actually provide the water? Because at some point it must be provided. In as much as you are saying it is free, it must be provided. And with that now, that has reduced that talk about water being free. It is not about water being free. It's about water availability and all that, and that costs resources which really have to be sourced for. And I think now, I don't think there is any, in my country at least, nobody is really talking about water being free, unless they want just to do it for political purposes. And that ends immediately they lose or win a seat. That's it.
Great, thank you so much for that response as well, Engineer Kubia. So the next question that we have is specifically for Dr. Bugisha. Please highlight the role of political leadership in the Uganda case and when might it be replicable in other countries? Over.
Can I have a comment on that? Yes, the issue of free water, yes, I think it is an issue that gets raised by politicians. Oh, yes, I was commenting on the issue of free water, then I can comment on the Ugandan case.
Perfect,
the
go
issue
ahead.
of free water, the issue of free water has been coming to us also. And the way we explain it is that, yes, if you need water, you find it in the lake and transported to your house. There is a cost to it, and that cost has to be paid somehow. And I think our experience is that when you give a good service, it is, and you explain to the people what goes into giving that good service, it is always easier to explain to these politicians. So I think I want to agree with other discussants that any service that requires input cannot be sustainably given free. And I think it is an issue of engaging. Sorry? Now, on the case of national water, be replicated in other countries. I don't think there's anything unique about the case of the economics of water management and knowing that water is a resource that needs to be managed efficiently. And so we should be talking about the issue of efficient management of water resources. And I think it can be done anywhere in the world. So, and we've been benchmarking with most utilities on this, delivering external services also sometimes. So it is something that we can all do, and it is you don't have to do it in the form National Water is doing it in Uganda, but it can be done. Other parts of the world of Africa have good case studies. We only need to focus much more on efficient management and strong leadership.
Great. Thank you very much for your insights on that and for the insights on the first question as well. So the next question that we have from the audience is, changing tariffs are politically uncomfortable. Do you see any good practice that you might provide about when in the political cycle to go about changing tariffs? So again, we're trying to learn a little bit more about the political side in this question. So any of the panelists want to take this on? And I'll repeat the question. Changing tariffs are politically uncomfortable. Do you see any good practice that you might provide about when in the political cycle to go about changing tariffs?
Can I comment?
Please do.
I don't think Ella is about when. I think it's about depoliticizing the tariff overall, because you can never talk of the right time to change a tariff. In fact, if politicians want to interfere with anything, they will always do it. It doesn't matter when. So it is important to work towards depoliticizing the tariff. And one of the ways is to make sure that you are basing it on good data, because a lot of areas, especially in developing countries, you find the good data is a problem. Even the data for consumption is a problem. So it is important that as technical people, we actually work on those technical areas, but also we should not actually be the ones talking about perceptions. We should have the courage, because sometimes it's really not about perceptions or fearing the politicians. It's about the courage of the technocrats to actually present a tariff. There are a number of times which the Kenya regulator has felt compelled to present that tariff to the political class, and you actually try to explain where you are coming from, because there will never really be a good time. You really have to see your sector and the crisis you are addressing and agree that somehow we must take some of these radical decisions. Thank you.
Can I make a comment?
Sure, great. And that would be the last comment before we close. We're almost on time. Thank you, but go ahead.
I want to agree with my good friend Robert that we need to depoliticize issues of water management. And for me, from my experience in Uganda, is if you are giving a good service, these politicians will get more convinced with good services for their people. And the idea is, if you are giving a good service and you don't over democratize tariff changes, the politicians will normally not have any problem, because they would normally have a problem because their people are complaining. So you have to deal with issues to do with listening the complaints from the voters. And for us in Uganda here, what we do is to try to link politicians to the services we are giving their people. And of course, then with mechanism that we agreed with politicians. If the tariff indexation has brought some tariff changes and people pick it to the increased services they are getting. Or rather in simplified visuals, comparing the tariff they are paying, the 20-liter jerrycan with the other commodities they are buying, they normally easily get convinced that actually water is very, very cheap. And that has made our life easy.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for that. And with that, we will close our first webinar of the series. We've taken you through a journey with Deanne talking about principle of paying and the importance of that and equity and efficiency, and Katarina going ahead talking about really balancing and thinking about cost recovery and affordability, and really that we're good on the technical side, but not quite. The ugly side is really we're subsidizing those that already have good services. So how do we change that? And also really thinking through, hearing the utility presentations about the importance of good services. Political interference can be reduced if the services are good. And so that's definitely a good takeaway. And lastly, I think it's interesting to see a convergence in opinions about efficient management is really important. And it's not about increasing tariffs or when to increase the tariffs. It's about depoliticizing tariffs, and to be able to do it so that we can actually expand services and get universal access and sustainable services to all. And so with that, I will officially close this event. Thank you very much for tuning in, and we hope to keep the discussions with you moving forward. Thank you so much, and thank you to our distinguished panelists today for joining us.